Welcome to Social Science 309. Today's lecture is on co-design. We all have some ideas, right, about what co-design is. It could be the act of drawing together, writing together, sharing these ideas and drawings on blogs and chat groups, Facebook groups, WhatsApp. But what is also interesting about co-design is the productive and positive effects of working together. When we draw or write together, barriers that had previously inhibited dialogues could potentially be broken down. And this is because in this process, the people involved can gain greater capacity to sort of speak and the capacity to act and control their bodies, their voices, and ultimately the agency on their own accord. In the process of offering stakeholders greater capacity to act, they are more involved in the generation of concepts and forms. Thus, the options that are generated come from within the event of co-design, and this kind of differs quite differently from sort of a more conventional design approach where the designer merely gives people two or three options to choose from. And so, in the more conventional kind of approach, options are generated from outside the agency of the stakeholders. Now, you might recall a few weeks ago we had talked about how ethics can be seen as gaining greater capacity to speak and act on one's own accord. And ethics such is not just a matter of implementing or abiding by a code of behavior. If we change, it is by our own accord. If we transform, it's by our own accord, a will to transform by ourselves rather than sort of something that's imposed. Ethics attends to the particularities of the event rather than simply relying entirely on an external evaluation or judgment system. So, in this sense, the ethics generated is situated in an ongoing co-design process. But why is co-design not more widespread in sort of the general community and specifically in the design community? And I suspect it has partly to do with our current imagination of the designer as a creative hero. The design industry, of course, props this idea up quite a fair bit. You see design awards being given out to individuals, never really a neighborhood or a community. In the case of sort of urban planning, the mastermind team is often made up of a few key players who are recognized for their efforts, rather than sort of the greater sort of community they're working with. This perpetuates the myth of the visionary. And besides the design community, the market itself also perpetuates this myth by making the famous individual designer a brand. Individualism becomes a selling point. The unfortunate thing about the celebration and hyping up the individual designer is the corresponding devaluation of non-designers into people who are incapable of creating new things and new ideas. In fact, this myth stresses individualism so much that it ignores how the star design of many of these visionaries are often the result of a confluence of dialogues, a confluence of concepts coming together, drawings from different people, and some of these different people might actually be non-designers in the conventional sense of what design is supposed to be. And even artificial intelligence might contribute to this so-called star design. So in this sense, we may suggest co-design already exists, even if we think it doesn't. Now, the tricky part is how do we make co-design's importance a lot more apparent and increase our investment into this mode of working and thinking? Enzo Mancini's writing on social innovation may be helpful here, for us to craft a democratization of design and decision-making processes. First, Mancini begins by asking us to be with the society with more care and really learn to see people and communities who act outside dominant thought of behavior and patterns of capital D design. This is to unlearn how we see non-designers. Non-designers may not necessarily create by drawing, building models, prototyping, or graphically laying out relations between parts. But nonetheless, they are capable of articulating future worlds by describing the sensibilities and even political and spatial situations that are possible. We can learn that describing the future may not just be how the future must look like in terms of a 3D representation or something like that. Creating and describing the future may be a matter of articulating how the future feels. Now, people gather to share these feelings, and more importantly, the enunciation of these feelings are often emerging from lines of communications non-designers already have, although they may not sort of consciously call these lines of communications design dialogues or charrettes or whatever terms we use as designers. And perhaps it is us designers who have to understand imagining futures doesn't necessarily have to mean doing designerly things. This is to unlearn what we consider as design, unlearn what is the proper materials of design as processes and outcomes. The fact that non-designers can actually work together to forge a sense of what future worlds might be, even without conventional representational techniques, points to the possibility that non-designers are already creative. They, in fact, form what Enzo Mancini would call creative communities. One example of a creative community could be something like a neighborhood walking tour. Such things bands together sort of like-minded people, many of whom are not architects, not urban planners, or anyone sort of professionally that train in city design, spatial design. They simply could be people with stories to share, a sense of how the future may feel as they extrapolate from their reading the sense of the present. From walking tours, what may emerge may be more social, politically oriented groups. And these groups may in turn sort of organize themselves into sort of produce sort of social impact and actions that could help sort of transform for the better how public realm could be sort of experienced and be designed. Even if they don't, not all these members have sort of the requisite training for civil engineering, landscape architecture, and design skills. Knowing these capable creative communities do exist outside the dominant quote-unquote design fields, the proper design fields, perhaps it is we designers who have to rethink what the design processes are and who the actors might be. We might have to move away not just from the creative hero figure, but also any insistences that the designer is the final arbitrator of meaning and form. This entails us actively recrafting our technique to not repress the agencies of others and the voices of others. And this can be sort of more effectively sort of executed by plugging ourselves more intimately into these existing creative social networks. What's also important is we shouldn't subordinate the participants' narratives, their stories, into a preconceived, pre-planned resolve scheme. Rather, we have to think about a plan, a scheme, as sort of a series of hybrids that are sort of crafted together jointly. And sometimes these hybrids, these schemes may even retain conflicts so as to remind ourselves what future transformations might be, that the world is never going to be properly resolved. Thus, there's no ideal co-design process. Steps are reinvented each time. It is a question of how to cultivate ongoing redesign of our thinking and working processes. At the same time, this is also a reinvention of thinking and working processes that needs to extend to not just designers, but also all participants. As such, one might say co-design should be transformative for all. Designers and non-designers in their interaction generate not just new concepts and forms, but new identities, new sensibility towards the world and social systems. In any case, how do we move forward with co-design? What are some practical steps to take? To gear towards this transformative approach to design and sort of communication, we need to move towards new ways to conduct design. Elizabeth Sanders, a leading scholar on the topic of new design, noted one way is through participatory design. Participatory design is more than simply consultation with the public or community to get buy-ins and agreements. It also differs from sort of user-centric design, because user-centric design still very much depends on the designer's expertise and final arbitration to translate the user's demands into an end product. Instead, with participatory design, the expertise and knowledge that feeds the outcome is derived from outside the domain of the proper professional design office, as you can see in this third picture, the third diagram here. The design activity, the outcomes, is really built outside of this line between sort of the design office and the sort of people, the community. The new rules are thus the rules of networks, not hierarchies. Ideas are never unique to the individual. They are rhizomatic. Ideas are rhizomatic, dispersed and folded across different territories and voices, only to present themselves differently each moment. The other thing Sanders noted is this. With co-design, we need to shift what we picture as design from form-based to experience-based. When Sanders proposed refocusing more on experience, she isn't dismissing form altogether or completely. And I would suggest we may read her as saying, rather than just focusing on producing forms and objects and chasing the best mechanical function, we might also add, how do forms produce experience? And we can build more and more experiences as we communicate more. From sharing about experiences, we actually experience new insights, sensations, which may then lead to even newer lines of thinking and action, maybe new forms. Thus, we can say experience produces experience. This is why Sanders says experiencing is a constructive activity. That is, a user's experience is constructed of two equal parts, what the communicator provides and what a communicatee brings to the interaction. Where the two parts overlap, it's where the actual communication is. So, when people ask, which comes first, experience or communication, we might suggest that they actually both emerge simultaneously. I'll elaborate a bit here. For example, you and I could be speaking to each other, but in the course of our conversation, we will interrupt each other. Interruptions may actually cause us to change not just the way we would present a concept or concepts, but the entire substance and relations that actually make up those concepts. Effectively, we create new concepts amidst the conversation. Concepts transform according to how we engage with and appreciate each other's latent and tacit knowledge. In the sense, creation is communication and vice versa. And in fields like urban planning or media, the ground is literally always shifting, generating new experiences. As such, the communication about new experiences is always ceaseless. And in turn, the experience of new channels of communication is also ceaseless. We have a shifting map or trace of the outcome. The outcome always eludes us every time we think we have it in focus. Sanders herself points out that we can't really design experience. This is the nature of co-design as situated in real time. It eschews the myth of the eternally good object. It isn't to refuse making objects, but to simply recognize objects are always off its time. And time, even in mini epoch itself, is constructed by changing intersections of concepts, histories, narratives, etc. We have thus entered what Sanders calls a post-design phase. Post-design is not about specific methods or processes. It's about an emergent visual language that is used to express and interpret those ideas and feelings that are often very difficult to express merely in words or text. Second, post-design is an attitude about people. It is about the recognition that all people have something to offer, and when given the means to express themselves, can be both articulate and creative. This harks back to sort of like our earlier discussion about what Enzo Mancini said, that people already form creative communities. Third, post-design is contextual. Understanding, empathizing with people who experience artifacts, interfaces, systems, and spaces can be accomplished by communicating with them in the places where they live, work, and play, while they live, work, and play. And This ties into our earlier idea how we designers should be submerged, into the sort of communities we're working with, rather than sort of stand hierarchically on top of it. Post design is, of course, participatory. It emphasizes the direct and active participation of all stakeholders in the design development process. This makes the deliverables of design more meaningful to the people who will ultimately benefit from them. Again, this links back to our earlier point about participation, agency, and ethics. Post-design is also ultimately co-design. It can harness the collective and infinitely expanding set of ideas and opportunities that emerge when all the stakeholders are invited to play the game. Post-design is an ongoing process, lastly. People's needs change and the experiences change. Relations between people change over time. Post-design is not a linear process, but a continual intersection of changing perspectives. Today, it blends design and the arts with the applied social sciences and blends them both tomorrow with new and emerging technologies. So, to facilitate this post-design communication and to ensure a continual intersection of different perspectives, there's some toolkits we can adopt. Elizabeth Sanders suggested two kinds of toolkits. One is the emotional toolkits, which might consist of things like collages, diaries that show and tell stories and dreams, feelings, fears, and aspiration. The second kind of toolkit is the cognitive toolkits, and these might be sort of maps and other modes of functionality, diagrams of relations, flowcharts, working processes. The aim of the cognitive toolkits is to communicate how people understand and or misunderstand things, events, and places. Of course, there are no determined ways on how these collages and flowcharts must be represented. It's perhaps not unlike this diagram you see on top here, which illustrates how relationships are drawn and redrawn over and over again. Each path that is taken can sometimes cross unto itself, transforming its own sort of its own composition. In fact, emotional and cognitive tools can be mashed together, mixed, and used together. There might be a diagram that is a complex collage of maps and dreamscapes. Sometimes those dreams may not have to be fully articulated, and those lines drawn between one reverie to another need not articulate every commonality, difference between the two. The lines are there to suggest existing and potential motions and movements and interactions without necessarily spelling out a fixed socioeconomic or political power relation. Thrown into this moving image, one may suggest communication is as much an affective event as it is a legible transmission of ideas. What I mean by an affective event is that in this communication process, the people, the parties involved can generate different senses of what may come and be empowered or upset by them. The key thing is sometimes trust and social bonding may emerge from these events which affect us in ways that can't even be described in words or images. The affect is something that changes us without us exactly knowing what the cause and effects are. From bonding, an empowered will to experiment and transform together may take shape. But Sanders is quick also to note one cannot design a determined experience or design a determined affect. No matter how in-depth we communicate, you cannot guarantee mixing this object with that graphic, with that text, with that place would generate this particular experience, this particular affect. A will to experiment and transform does not guarantee a determined outcome. Extending Sanders' idea, one might say that the design process itself is kind of like a wicked problem. It has no definitive outcome. All parties involved in the co-design process have to have an understanding that a range of possible outcomes can be expected. In a way, what we really do is we design for the potential to experience different experiences. Now, I'll conclude today's lecture with a case in Guangzhou where co-design was used to sort of create a space of dialogue. In this project, Guangzhou-based urban designer Jason Ho wanted to give something back to the hawkers, the uncles and aunties at the market he frequents. Um, the market is also next to his gallery in a new office building. You can see the office building on the right here, on the right edge of the screen. And this is where the market is outlined in sort of the white dash line. After hanging out with the hawkers, Jason found out many of them saw the gallery and the new office building as an impenetrable space. Some said they were afraid to enter the building to even use the washroom because the market, in some ways, doesn't have its own washroom. Through these conversations, Jason realized communications between the hawkers and the art or design community was difficult, partly because of the art and design community's image of impenetrability. Walking around with the hawkers in the market's vicinity to better understand how they feel about the neighborhood, some of them raised the point about how life used to exist between buildings. But now, the new buildings are all inward looking and do not frame the street. The uncles and aunties, those hawkers, said that it was nice how buildings used to connect to each other. They talk to each other. Not necessarily physically joined, but the activities that spilled out from the edges of building were able to sort of tie separate building structures together. The hawkers may not be able to articulate now the concept of social architectural connection or the potentials lying within the interstitial realm via diagrams the way we urban designers and architects do, but they nonetheless can articulate a sense of something missing when new buildings have just blank alloy panel walls. Reflecting more on this point about connections, the participants thought maybe what was needed was less a to design a better market for themselves, but to find ways to spill the gallery out, spill art out onto the streets, to make the art world perhaps a little less impenetrable, and to reactivate that space between the office building and the market. Of course, it was financially infeasible to punch more openings on either the market building and certainly at the office building. But it is, however, possible to mount a series of sort of window boxes displaying items from the hawkers' daily lives, and then place tables and chairs in the lane between the office building and the market. The glass boxes were assembled from old windows from the neighborhood that were discarded from the demolition of old buildings. In the sense, these window frames you can see on the left of the screen becomes a sort of a memory of the neighborhood. It doesn't hold precious objects or artifacts, but simply daily objects for the people that use the space. Most importantly, it is to continue to organize activities and events with the hawkers, the uncles and aunties, to give that interstitial space life. As mentioned earlier, it is to create an experience. These tables, chairs, and window boxes will not guarantee any particular experience to be produced. It is a form, but a form that aid in the production of new dialogues, new conversations, communications, and ultimately new kinds of experiences. It wasn't the old experience of sort of the old city, but simply sort of looking at how the old and new can sort of get into dialogue with each other to create new experiences. And ultimately, one might say or add, all this was kind of done without any investment from either the public or private sectors. It is not an attempt to formalize informal street activities, but to have a moving platform for new informalities, half new, half formed yet creative dialogues to occur in a space that is not closed off. It is the dialogues that make up the space. Co-design always entails the designer being transformed as much as the environment they are thrust into. Lastly, one may suggest what is ethical in this project here is that the uncles and aunties are involved in the creation and of sort of the space. They're more capable of acting and speaking on their own accord rather than simply receiving or choosing between options given to them by a designer. Thank you.